All right, hello and welcome everybody to our almost final session of the day. And I have the privilege of being joined here right now by Chipp Norcross, who you met earlier, as well as Catherine Brown, who is on our team here at Singularity University. We're going to be talking about complexity and how leaders can navigate unpredictable situations. So Catherine is the Vice President of Executive Education. She oversees our open enrollment offerings, including the flagship executive program. She joined SU on the heels of a 12-year tenure at Google. While there, she was a founding member of the executive development function, creating and delivering world-recognized leadership development strategies and programs aimed at growing Google's most senior leaders. Catherine's passionate about helping leaders navigate complexity and maximize their potential. Her specific areas of research and expertise include curriculum strategy, exploring the connection between well-being and performance, developing leaders' learning agility, and women in leadership. She launched the first ever executive leadership program for women at Google, as well as the first ever well-being focused program. A passionate and experienced educator, she holds a master's in education from Harvard and a BA in sociology from UCLA. When she's not at work doing all that amazing stuff, you can find her hiking trails at the foothills, in the pool, early in the morning, or playing with her kids. She lives in the Bay Area of California with her husband, Scott, 2 kids, Abby and Parker, and crazy energetic puppy, Kona. Alrighty, with that, let's get started. We are, just so you guys know, we're having some connectivity issue, but hopefully you can see them and hear them. I'm about to kick it over right now. Here we go.
All right, thank you very much, Adam. Hello again. I met, I was here a couple of hours ago for a session I did with Paul D. Roberts. And in that session, I talked a couple of times about complexity theory as well as the idea of polarities. And here to spend some time exploring both of those concepts, I've got my friend and colleague, Catherine Brown. Catherine, can you
Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Catherine and I met each other a couple of years ago, and I think even in our first conversation, we were talking about her passions around complexity theory. And I, instantly was fascinated by that. And as we were talking about important topics to bring to this virtual summit, complexity theory was very much at the top of that list. And Catherine, I want, the way this is going to go is I'm going to, we're going to have a little bit of a back and forth between the two of us versus just a straight presentation. So Catherine, if you could start off by telling us a little bit about the concept of complexity theory and just really why you're so passionate about it, why you feel like it's such an important way of approaching the world.
Yeah, so thanks, Chip. As Adam mentioned, my background is in leadership development, so I've been keenly interested in understanding the kinds of challenges that are facing leaders for years now. And one of the things I've noticed is an increase in the complexity of the challenges that our leaders are dealing with. Certainly that was the case when I was working at Google and helping them with some of their challenges, and I've seen it even more broadly. So it was a few years ago while I was at Google that I became interested in this topic and started exploring some of the concepts that I'm excited to share with you now, because I would contest that the direction we're headed is going to be more complex rather than less complex. I think this is relevant.
So, and you use the word complex, and I feel like it's a word that needs some definition in this context, because we use complex to describe a lot of things, but it has a very clear definition when you're talking about it with complexity theory. So can you help walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So to do that, let me start with kind of doing a compare and contrast. And I want to think about the kinds of problems we used to face maybe 20 plus years ago, and the way we used to organize information, and talk a bit about how that's changed and how complexity is at play. So I'm going to start with this image, which I can get it to move. There we are. I hope you all can see that. So this is an image that is near and dear to my heart. It was a big part of my childhood, maybe also yours, Chip, and maybe some of you out there. This is a picture of a card catalog.
Hey, Catherine.
Yeah.
Adam is sending a note saying that people cannot see the slides right now and asking if you can reshare them.
Let me see. Hold on. Yes is the answer to that. Let's try this.
Great, got them now.
Are we good?
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that, folks. So this is a picture of the card catalog, Dewey Decimal System, and this was one way we used to organize information, right? Kind of a little bit in my childhood, what was the equivalent of Google now. So we would go, we'd use this, it was consistent, it was reliable, we would find a series of numbers that would enable us to find a book in a library, and we would get what we needed. It was a really good system for the way we structured information at the time. And I like it as a metaphor for the way we used to solve pretty straightforward problems and sort of an environment a lot of us grew up in. But what I've noticed has happened over the last few years is similar to what this sort of graphic represents, which is actually from the SU Hub a couple of years ago. So this is essentially what many of us have experienced and what a lot of the leaders I've worked with has experienced, which is you think you're on one trajectory and things are going a certain way, but then disruption, innovation happens, and you end up finding that you're in a very different place. And so for this metaphor, as opposed to thinking about the Dewey Decimal System and card filing as the way we found information, now it looks something a little bit more like this. So this is a really interesting graphic that I love, and it basically is an illustration. It's actually 3D. You can go in and manipulate it if you go to that URL. It's really interesting. This image represents 5% of the information on Wikipedia 5 years ago. So it's over 250,000 articles with over 10 million connections. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And you can see in here that you've got some circles where it's like they're a little bit bigger. Well, that's where hubs of information of similar topics are, and you can see all of the interconnectivities. It's really pretty remarkable. So you can see, and it's clear that the way that we've navigated information and structured it has really evolved. And so we need to, in response, evolve a little bit differently as well too to manage all of this complexity we're now seeing.
So I know that there's a pretty interesting model that we have talked about that helps one to be able to determine if they are dealing with a complex challenge or one that might be complicated. So can you help us to understand how to use a framework like that and walk us through that?
Yeah, so one of the frameworks that I found really useful in this space was created by a sort of complexity expert named David Snowden, and many of you might be familiar with him and his work. And the model is called the Cynefin model. It's a Welsh word, so it's kind of spelled a little funny, and it basically loosely translates to a sense of place or habitat. And this is really a sense-making tool, and it's a way for us to assess where we are and what kind of challenges we're dealing with. So the first distinction he makes in this model is from the land of the predictable versus the land of the unpredictable. So on the right side of the screen, you can see this is where predictability lies. And the first domain he talks about is called obvious. So this is where cause and effect are really clear, and this is the space of best practice. This is automation. You push a button, the same thing happens. You push it again, you're pretty much guaranteed the same thing is going to happen again. And in this sort of domain, the most effective approach is really to categorize whatever it is you're dealing with and then apply the solution that's pretty known. So automated things we do same over and over again, like checking into a hotel, the same exact processes each time. We know we need to go to the front desk, we need to give them identification information, they give us a key, so on. So that's the world of the obvious. The second domain, which is also in the land of the predictable, is called complicated. And this is a little different because making progress with complicated problems really usually requires expertise to see the cause and effect. So this is a space of good practice, consultants, analysts. So this is where you analyze the information you have, you apply expertise to solve the problem. So in some cases, this looks like a list of procedures or checklists. So examples of this would even be like building a monument or performing a surgical procedure. There is a checklist for that. There is a way you do it from start to finish that's very specific, probably requires deep expertise, but there is a solution. So that's the land of the complicated. Now, if we go to the other side of this model, the domain in unpredictable that we're going to talk about first is that of complexity. So in complexity, cause and effect can only really be seen in hindsight. It's awfully difficult to see it when you're in it. This is the land of emergent practices. Because there's unpredictability and ambiguity and complexity, we have to respond in the moment and being really adaptive. So this, in complexity, the approach that's most effective is to experiment and learn, and then use those learnings to move in a direction and experiment again. So any movement that requires human behavior to change or any effort you're doing in that direction is complex inherently because human beings are complex. We're unpredictability by nature. That's probably part of what makes us human. You can ask me a question today, I'll have an answer. You can ask me the same question tomorrow. I may or may not have the same answer because I'm unpredictable, because I'm human. So when we talk about challenges within organizations and within our world that involve getting a bunch of people to do something differently, you're squarely in the land of complexity. So examples of complex challenges, things that are messy and interconnected and have related points and pressures, things like climate change, like diversity and inclusion, like reorganizations. There's a human element to that, there's a technical element to that, but it's very complex. And then the last domain that he talks about is chaos. So this is an area, usually to be avoided if possible. This is where there's really no relation to cause and effect. It's described as novel practice, and I think it's interesting because lately we've been hearing the term novel related to coronavirus, right? This novel coronavirus. And that's because it was something that was previously unexperienced, and that's the nature of chaos when you're in it. And when you're experiencing that, it's really about acting first. There is no time to analyze, there's no time to run experiments, you just need to triage. So that's chaos. Things like natural disasters fall into this category. I would argue there's been an element of what we're dealing with now that falls into this category, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. The last two things about this model that I want to point out that are interesting is this first one, a cliff. So why is that little thing there called the cliff? So it turns out that one of the dynamics that Dave Snowden mentions in this model is that if organizations, individuals, ecosystems become too complacent in the obvious space, so they're kind of on automation mode, on autopilot. If they don't recognize shifts in the landscape around them in that context, they can easily slip into chaos and sort of miss the boat. I think about some of the organizations that got caught in the swirl of the rapid advent of our transition to the use of mobile devices for both information gathering and also working. And there were more than a few organizations who failed to see the signals in the system that the context was shifting in that direction, who ended up having to really reinvent themselves. So that can happen. It's one of the sort of warnings in the system. And then the last thing I'll mention is this space in the middle. So Snowden refers to this as disorder. And disorder is an interesting place. It's where you are a bit frozen because there's uncertainty or disagreement as to what domain you're actually dealing with. And it can cause a little bit of delay or paralysis even. From disorder, the most helpful thing you can do is seek to find more information that gives you an indication of which domain you're actually dealing with. So disorder, hopefully not there very long, but we definitely see it here and there and can be a hindrance in making progress. So this is one model, one way of looking at it. I've given a very high level overview, but it helps me understand how to assess sort of what it is we're dealing with.
So a couple of follow-ups on this as we think through it. Earlier today we were talking about just how to manage through different situations where maybe the situation might be complex, but we're trying to use complicated interventions. That seems like a thing that most of us have become most comfortable with, probably, or perhaps because of our schooling or the way that we have just been trained over time. Can you say a little bit about, I guess I'm looking at this framework and thinking that there would be great value of just being able to put it on the wall, and when having a discussion about a topic, getting everybody in the room to agree which one of these different regions that we're in. Is that something you've encountered?
Definitely. So a lot of the leaders that I have worked with sort of come to me certainly with challenges, and I love to work through them with them. And quite often the starting point is I'm feeling stuck, or I'm frustrated, or I'm having a hard time making forward progress with this challenge. And at the heart of it, sometimes, in fact often, is sort of a mismatch, a misidentification about what domain they're dealing with, and therefore an intervention that doesn't actually match up. And the place I see this most frequently is conflating complicated and complex. So maybe we can take a deeper dive into those two specifically and talk about the difference between them, because they are different, but sometimes it can be hard to see. So in the land of the complicated, these are challenges and these are problems that have a right answer, can be solved. Like I said, expertise might be required, but there is a solution. Different experts might take different ways to arrive at the solution, but they usually get to the same place. And here you need to gather data and analyze it. So this is the place where specialists, consultants, experts are super helpful. And problem-solving mindset really is useful. And I want to make it a point here to distinguish. There isn't anything good or bad about complicated or complex challenges. They're just different. There are times and situations when having a problem-solving mindset is the exact right solution. And as Chip kind of mentioned, many of us were raised in environments where we were heavily rewarded for having that excellent problem-solving mindset and being able to get to root cause and problem solve. And that's great. It's great if you're dealing with a challenge that is a complicated problem. But you can imagine if you apply that to a complex challenge, it becomes a bit more tricky. So in the land of complexity, there really isn't a one right answer or a solution. And the goal is not to actually arrive at a destination, but rather to head in a direction. And in order to do that, you need to take a step back and see the system. For those of you familiar with the work around adaptive leadership, it's this concept of stepping on the balcony, because only when you get away from it are you able to see all the interconnectivities and understand the way they're related. And really identify what those moving parts are and how they're interdependent on other parts. So this is the environment where having a mindset of curiosity and wanting to run experiments is actually far more helpful than applying a black and white problem-solving mindset. But you can see how if you mismatch those, you'd end up in a pretty frustrating place.
So, and it would seem like right now, just from what I'm witnessing, it would appear that we're clearly in a complex, maybe even a chaotic situation in a lot of ways. But it seems like there is a lot of complicated problem solving that people are trying to take in order to solve it. And I think we're in a place where we're going to have to see how that evolves over time. But so one question I would have is, as you think about this specific COVID-19 pandemic, how would you apply the Canon Model to what we're seeing around us today to help us be able to understand the different domains in which we might need to be operating?
So I think, like many adaptive challenges, there are aspects of this pandemic that we're facing that fit into each of the domains. And I'm going to go through a few that were top of mind for me as I was preparing for this, but it by no means is a comprehensive list. But let's take a look. What might fall into sort of what different domain? In the space of obvious, so we all know that certain health protocols reduce the spread of this illness, right? We all know washing our hands, demonstrating social distancing. We know that these are effective in not spreading the illness. Okay, so that is a pretty straightforward, obvious thing. It's proven to be effective. In the complicated space, a few things that came to mind. This is where things like procedures around production and distribution of test kits or of medical equipment or face masks, or maybe it's the procedures around quarantine and containment. Certainly emergency response protocols. There's a very specific order of actions to take that are really effective. So that would be complicated because it often requires expertise. Over in the land of the complex, I mentioned that obvious is that we know that these health protocols reduce the spread of illness, but the actual effort of getting everyone in the world to follow those health recommendations, that's a complex challenge, because now you're talking about getting a movement to have human beings change their behavior. Transitioning education systems to virtual learning. I'm experiencing this with my kids at home watching this. It seems on the surface like, well, it could be a technical thing. You just flip the switch and now we're doing everything online. But in fact, again, these are kids, especially very complex organisms, and they're on their own learning curve of understanding how to use these new technologies, how to engage differently. You have to think about the curriculum strategy differently. Lots of moving parts to this, so that's a complex challenge that I'm seeing too. And then tracking the spread of the illness. There's an element of unpredictability. I can't say with certainty where it's going to pop up next or when. So dealing with that is certainly complex. And then chaos, probably the initial response. So at the very beginning, there was no time for analysis or to create a plan. We just needed to triage. Life and death decisions needed to be made, and it's really difficult in times like this, but there's certainly a chaotic element at the beginning of it. The last thing I'll say in terms of this model and the pandemic we're dealing with has to do with where we're seeing some disorder. So with how quickly this came upon us, many governments and organizations really have had a hard time understanding the magnitude of the epidemic and being able to figure out what domain we're even dealing with. They didn't have plans that were ready to be implemented immediately on how to deal with this because it was so unexpected. And we've seen as a result some instances of either infighting or disagreement that has slowed things down here and there. So that might be an example of where we've seen a little bit of disorder.
Great, thank you, Catherine. So, a related concept, especially in looking at complexity, is the idea of polarities. And I referenced this a little bit earlier today, the polarity between anti-fragility in building your organization and efficiency. And I think the polarity model is a really helpful one to be able to help us navigate looking at two seemingly opposite decisions like that. So can you take us through that polarity model and where that framework comes from?
Absolutely. So polarities is one of the things I've found really sticky and useful in the space of complexity theory. And the reason is it turns out they are abundant in complex systems. So let me just start with the definition. Polarity is just very straightforward, two equally desirable things that seem in opposition to one another. And I want to make a clear distinction that as opposed to problems that can be solved, polarities are tensions to be constantly managed. So very classic examples, some of you are like, quality versus speed. So we want it to be high quality, but we want to get it out there quickly. Sometimes it seems like we have to do one to trade off the other. Doing what's right for my team or what's right for the overall organization. One we're seeing right now, transparency versus security and safety. We want to be open and honest as we can, but we know that if we do it too much, it's going to put people at risk, maybe even cause a lot of panic. Making quick decisions and getting consensus, we want to do both of those things. Again, sometimes things you feel like you have to do one at the expense of the other, or a focus on short term and a focus on long term. That's another classic polarity that I see. And what's interesting about polarities in general is that they're dynamic tensions that are sort of always shifting. So I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like, and to do that, I'm going to introduce the concept of a map that's been really useful. So this is a straightforward map. We're going to walk through, let's take the polarity of quality and speed as an example. On the top half of this map, this is what is good about investing in that end of the pole. So what are all the upsides we see if we invest in that? And on the bottom, what happens if we overdo it? If we over-index, what are the negative implications we experience? So let's walk through this one. So the upside of investing in quality, strong brand reputation, we've got happy users, reliable products, all of those things are good. And what's good if we invest in speed? Well, maybe we're quick to innovate, we beat competitors to the market, we learn from really fast iterations of learning as we go. Those are all good. However, if we overinvest in quality, if we focus too heavily on that, we might miss some shifts in the landscape and our competitors. We might get a reputation for being slow or maybe even not innovative. On the flip side, if we overinvest in speed, our quality could suffer, right? We could start being known for sloppy work and lose trust of our customers. So what's interesting about this model is that this top half really represents the greatest hope. And it's actually what people in camp quality and camp speed both want. I've often worked with leadership teams where we have factions of people who are in one camp or the other, and they see each other in oppositions, but actually really they're after the same thing, which is that greatest hope, and also avoiding the bottom half, which we call the deepest fear. Everybody doesn't want that to happen. So we know that this is kind of the way we can think about polarities. A couple of the dynamics I wanted to explore. This first one has to do with that movement and the tension I talked about. So you'll see this sort of figure 8 diagram in the middle here. I want you to imagine that we're starting in the middle of it. We're starting in the middle of this diagram, and we're going along maybe to the upper left. So we are headed in the direction of seeing all the benefits of investing in quality, and that's going along just fine. But if we overdo it, which sometimes we tend to, we start to see the downsides, right? So we've over-indexed on quality, and now we're experiencing all those negative sides that we just reviewed. When you're in the bottom half and experiencing those downsides, an interesting thing happens with a lot of us leaders, which is you get this sort of tunnel vision where all you can imagine is how quickly you need to get to the opposite sides. So you need to be, in this case, experiencing the upsides of speed. So we tend to head that direction, and quite often we slingshot our way there and find ourselves overdoing it. And just like on the other side, when we overdo it, we begin to see the downsides of that side of the pole as well. So in this case, we overdo it on investing in speed, and now we're seeing the downsides of that. And again, I'm in the downside, I'm seeing tunnel vision to the upper quadrant on the other side, so I slingshot the opposite direction. So you can see that this kind of figure 8 pattern begins to emerge, and this is very typical in polarities. And we know that this is a dynamic that exists. I said it's not a problem that can be solved, it's a tension to manage. So what do we do as leaders when we find ourselves struggling with this and oscillating back and forth like a yo-yo? Well, one of the things you can do is really finely tune your ability to identify early when you've slipped below that line into the negative side effects. So how are we going to know? What are the early warnings in the system? What will I be hearing in the hallway of my organization? Or what will the buzz be that will indicate to me that we may have overdone it and need to course correct? Because it turns out if we can get better at identifying those early warning signals, we can make micro corrections that enable us to spend less time underneath that line and more time above. So this is the concept of kind of raising or lifting the butterfly, right? So instead of spending equal time on upside or downside, or some cases more time on the downside than the up, how can we lift the butterfly? By getting really good at identifying what are those first indicators that we're gonna be watching out for that will enable us to know that it's time to course correct, right? So one of the things that we can do is sort of manage this tension and acknowledge that dynamic is gonna exist, but do our best to manage it. It means you have to be hyper aware of what's going on in the system. The last thing I'll say about the dynamic of polarities that I find really interesting has to do with the leadership skill that I think is going to be one of the most critical ones for the future, and that is empathy. And I know several of our presenters in the last few days have talked about this. I'm a big believer too, and this is partially why. I talked about that greatest hope and deepest fear. It turns out when we have a tension that is really real and very heated and emotional for people, and they are staunchly in whatever camp they're in this case, either camp quality, we need to invest in quality, or speed, we need to go faster. When they're deeply entrenched in that perspective, it's very difficult to see that the person on the other end of that pole, or the organization or the entity or the team, that you all actually want the same thing. And one of the ways you can do that is by taking a walk and sitting in their shoes. And I mean really viscerally understanding what the lived experience is for that person that has a different perspective. What pressures are they under? What fears are driving their perspective? What are they most concerned could happen? Because until you do that, it's really hard to see that you all actually want the same thing and you want to avoid the same things. And from my experience working with a lot of different leadership teams around this, it's a much different starting point of a conversation when you've been able to see someone else's perspective and understand, oh, okay, that's why you're sitting in camp quality. I get it. I have a different perspective, but I understand yours is a really different starting point. So it's one of the things that I've found really useful in helping to sort of peel apart some of these tensions that get really heated and can really slow us down.
Yeah, I think, Catherine, this whole piece on polarities and empathy, I will tell you that even as Paul and I were working on the session earlier, and this concept of the need to be anti-fragile, even if it meant possibly reducing efficiency, I started to feel a lot of discomfort with being able to put that perspective forward. Because when I was in business school, my favorite classes were things like operations management and supply chain management, and I was just thinking about how all of that is about efficiency. And I had this nagging feeling about just putting something out into the world that says maybe it shouldn't all be about efficiency, but finding this balance between the two is really what's going to be most important. And I think that if I think about what is the greatest hope that I would have for an organization, it's one that is both anti-fragile and able to cope with the kinds of shocks that we're seeing today, and also efficient in the way that it is not wasting money or not needlessly, I should say, wasting money or inventory. And honestly, I think about that with society as a whole right now, how we're at such a deficit of masks, of ventilators, of hand sanitizer, so many things where perhaps we have created, we've moved in this map that you've got here. Mm-hmm. We might be experiencing some of the downsides of efficiency. Yeah. And we have to think about how we really find the top half of this map, and we're able to reap the benefits of both perspectives. Mm-hmm. So, building on that, I think that I'm curious how you see this sort of framework applying to the COVID-19 pandemic.
just like any complex challenge, I think there are a lot of polarities at work here right now. One of the ones I see most acutely right now has to do with this desire to both maintain a functioning economy and also curb the spread of the illness. So I took a crack at applying this model to that. Again, would welcome your thoughts. I bet all of you have some really interesting ideas, but here are a few things that came to mind for me. So in the polarity where we have on the left side here a functioning, healthy economy, and the right side curbing the spread of this illness. Upsides of investing in both, right? If we invest in a functioning economy, probably avoid a recession or a depression. The economy might bounce back quicker after this is all over. People keeping their jobs without disruption. And on the other side, if we invest obviously in curbing the spread of this illness, boy, we can flatten that curve. Hopefully the medical systems are able to handle the load because we flattened it, fewer infections and deaths. All of that is what we want, and we collectively want all of that. However, if we over-index for either, there's a downside. So if we over-index for a functioning economy, so say we want people to still be out there supporting businesses, we want people still be coming to work, the disease actually might spread more rapidly because we're encouraging people to still do things that put them at risk. And if we do that, we could quickly see a healthcare system that's overwhelmed worldwide and probably generate a healthy dose of panic along the way. So that's not good. On the flip side, if we overinvest in a focus on curbing the spread of the illness, we could see ourselves in an economic downturn and recessions, and I would argue we're seeing some of that already. Small businesses could go out of business, unemployment rates could skyrocket. So equally not great things on both sides. So this is a tension that's really challenging to manage, but it's clear that just like in any complex challenge, there isn't one right answer that's going to fix the whole thing or make it better. But I think the more we can acknowledge that these polarities exist and see the shades of gray, I think it's going to enable us to move forward quicker, which we need.
So we're in a difficult time.
Yeah.
And there are a range of leaders, whether they're formal or informal leaders, that are listening to this, that may be leaders in their company, leaders in their community, or just leaders in their family. What advice would you give to them today to be able to start enacting this kind of complex complexity theory framework as a leader to be able to start making progress?
So a few things that come to mind, again, not a comprehensive list, but when we're navigating these challenges. So taking a step back to see the entire system of something you're facing right now, and asking yourself what domains live where. So what about this challenge is obvious or complicated or complex and chaotic? Because once you've identified that, then you can determine the best way to proceed that's going to be the right match for that domain. And when you're dealing specifically with complexity, what experiments can you run? How much can you learn as you go? There's an idea of in complexity theory around amplifying bright spots. I didn't talk much about it, but this is very real. Where can we find situations and places where things are working? And what can we do to reapply those elsewhere or to scale them? What can we learn from them? And then in places of conflict or friction, where there's a polarity at the heart of it, see what you can do to step in the shoes of someone else. See that challenge from somebody's totally different perspective. It's very easy for me to stay in my one-track mind, given my specific conditions and circumstances at home. I have one perspective. But what if I were in a different location? What if one of my family members was immunocompromised? I'd have a different point of view. And the more that we can do that and start sitting in each other's shoes, the better. And then identifying those early warning signs so we can kind of raise that butterfly. Those would be a few of the things I'd say. What I'll say lastly too, just in case some of you are curious, if you want to know more information about complexity theories and ideas and concept, I highly recommend this book. Jennifer Garvey Berger and Keith Johnston are awesome and amazing humans. I've partnered with them. I have no financial connection with them or incentive to mention this, but I do think that this is probably one of the best resources out there for understanding how you can practically apply the concepts of complexity theory. And of course, we'll make these slides available to all of you. And then lastly, I wanted to end with this quote, because I know we are close on time here. I read this week in a Forbes article by a contributor named Brian Robinson. Your perspective is the most powerful thing you can control in a situation that is beyond your control. Our perspectives so strongly influence our actions and our behaviors. And right now, I think the world needs us to be seeing this pandemic from all different perspectives and points of view, because only together do I think we're going to actually be able to move forward. So with that, I know we are coming short on time, so I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all. I welcome your questions if we have a few minutes to do so, and thanks.
Great, thank you, Catherine. We do have a couple of minutes, and I'm going to go ahead and ask the top questions that have been upvoted in the list. The first one is, what is the best way to train the mind to solve complex problems?
I like this question. I would say it's to put on your experimental and curiosity mindset. And sometimes the way I like to do that is actually to think about the population and the humans who have asked me, and from my experience, a lot of folks I know, the most thought-provoking questions, the deepest questions, the questions that make you go, wow, I need to think about that. And for me, it's kids. Kids ask these questions that sort of knock you off your feet and make you go, gosh, I don't know, I need to think about that. That's the mindset we need to be adopting. So if we're going to get good at navigating complexity, we need to be thinking like a child. We need to be curious. We need to be non-judging and instead seeking to understand and learn as we go. I think that's one of the most effective things we can do, honestly.
And if I can just build on that, you know, there are there are models out there around complex problem solving or creative problem solving, and some that are just that we know around us are things like design thinking. It isn't necessarily billed as solving complex problems, but that's really the same kind of empathy and experimental framework. Synectics, you know, it's a framework that is about creative problem solving and very much being able to experiment and be able to find non-linear ideas and solutions that may work. Because, you know, again, in this case, just trying to use the same solutions that we have seen in the past probably isn't going to necessarily work for a complex problem that might have a lot of this causal opacity that we've talked about. We have one more question, time for one more question, I should say, and that is, how do you understand whether your problem has an answer or not in the first place?
Well, that's a tricky question. Often it's really hard. I think what you've got to start doing is seeking to find a little bit more information to give you a sense of what it is you're dealing with. So if you think about that Canon Model, sometimes when you're first dealing with a complex challenge, it's hard to know where to start. And one of the concepts I didn't talk very much about in theory, but that is very much part of it, has to do with not going at the heart of what the problem really is, but actually starting around the edges. So this idea of nudging a system or poking to test things out and probing and seeing what you get as responses can sometimes help you understand the nature of the challenge in the first place. I know a lot of I can think of several times when I've worked with leadership teams or leaders individually, and they'll come and say, you know, I've got this big challenge, here's what's happening. And as I ask more questions, again, from a place of curiosity to understand what's going on, it emerges that actually what they thought was the heart of the problem is something entirely different, and it's fairly tangential. So what I'd say is seek to understand the nature of the problem first before you go after trying to solve it. Because once you identify whether you're dealing with something complicated or complex, then you can choose the right type of intervention that will give you greater likelihood of being able to make forward progress.
And I think just, you know, again, to build on that, if you thinking back to the last session that Paul and I were on, if it is something that appears mechanical, that probably has an answer. Yeah. If it is something that appears organic or involves a lot of organic beings, it probably doesn't have a single answer. And I think probably perhaps the greatest hazard is trying to use mechanical approaches to solving organic problems.
Yes.
You know, I think it's a great question, though, and I think a great one for us to be able to leave this session on. So, Catherine, I want to thank you for sharing complexity theory, sharing polarities. I know you're going to share this deck and some other resources with people, and there's other questions that were in here, and I think we're going to look for ways to be able to respond to those as well offline.
Great, I welcome them. Thank you all so much for joining.
Great, thanks everybody.